It's now my pleasure to hand over to Dan, who's an eminent scholar internationally. Have been very familiar with him for decades, read much of what he's written, and certainly commend that everybody else should do the same. And he's had a career that has taken him into two of the great pro-market institutes in the world, Heritage and Cato, and now runs the Center for Freedom and Prosperity, an organization he founded in the year 2000. His major research interests include tax reform. He's an advocate, as we are, to the extent we have a common view in the Free Market Foundation. We practice what we preach, so we're all free to disagree with each other, and we do a lot of that. A flat tax. And he does work in international tax competition, the economic burden of government spending, and fiscal policy issues. He's got many published papers, written many editorials that have been in the popular press and in journals, and he's very well known in the public policy community, widely networked. He's spoken in over 50 countries. His views are commonly carried in the media in the US mainly, but also in other countries. He's on the editorial board of the Cayman Financial Review and holds a PhD in economics from George Mason University. For those again in the free market Austrian school world will be very familiar with George Mason University, where he flunked on Austrian school economics, having gone there because he's an Austrian school economist, and where he worked instead on Australian superannuation. He is single, has 3 children, and therefore very interested in any rich heiresses who happen to be lawyers. He has done some bad things in his life. For example, forgot a meeting with one of the most senior government officials, the former speaker, and then he has another accomplishment apart from his intellectual accomplishments. He was in the over 55s team. That doesn't mean a team with 55 players, it means people who are over 55 years old. The softball team that won the US national championships in Vegas, so he's himself a formidable sports person. Dan, over to you, and I look very much forward myself to hearing what you have to say. And although I've met him in the past many times and read, I've never heard him speak, so this is for me a first. Dan, over to you.
Thank you.
Your luck was bound to run out. You're going to hear me speak today. I have to defend myself. For those of you who are familiar with the Austrian School of Economics, you have to read Mises and Hayek like they're apostles. And I don't know if any of you have tried to read Human Action in this room. I never get past the first chapter. I see that word praxeology and I begin to nod off. And so I just didn't have the proper appreciation for it. So yes, I did indeed fail the Austrian field exam, and I had to do public choice and industrial organization instead. Anyhow, I'm going to talk about the rule of law. Why is this not on the screen? Press what? F5. F5. There is no F5. There's a 5, but there's not a function 5. Oh, there we go. You did the right thing. I'm going to talk about the rule of law and national prosperity and some real-world evidence, and try to make this concrete, because we now have a very good theoretical foundation for why this matters for just the quality of governance in a country. But I want to sort of build upon that to emphasize why it also matters for the prosperity of a country. And I'm going to start with a little economics lesson. Every single economic theory, even Marxists, are going to agree that there are 2 factors of production, labor and capital. And if you want more economic output, you either have to have more labor, more capital, or you need to use your existing labor and capital more efficiently. Think of it as labor and capital being the ingredients, and the chef mixes the ingredients together. And the economic debates then are between people who think that the chef should be the government, politicians and bureaucrats, they get to decide how to mix labor and capital together. Those of us on the free market side, we think that competition and consumer preferences ultimately should decide the allocation of labor and capital. And the reason this matters is because if you get better economic growth, it makes a huge difference to how prosperous your people are. If you grow only 1% a year, think Italy or France or Greece or something like that, it takes you 70 years to double your GDP. If you grow, say, 3 to 4% a year, which is what the US historically experienced, you double your GDP in 20 years. And then if you're like a fast-growing tiger economy, Hong Kong or Singapore, you can literally double your GDP in as little as 7 years. And I want to give you some real-world examples of this. Here's a chart showing US per capita GDP, that's the orange line, and Mexican per capita GDP, that's the blue line. If you simply took US economic growth for every year since 1895 and simply reduced it by 1 percentage point, the US today would almost be as poor as Mexico. So 1 percentage point of economic growth doesn't sound like much. And if we're simply talking about this year compared to next year, whether you grow at 2.3% or 3.3%, you probably wouldn't notice. But over time, with the power of compounding, it makes a huge difference how fast your economy grows. That's, and I'm going to keep coming back to the fact that you do the right policies with the right system in place, i.e. rule of law, you can get much faster growth. Now, this is an example with 1% difference in economic growth. I want to show you something even more that would seem very tiny. What if your economy simply grows 0.2% faster? Now, that sounds so trivial, none of us would ever even see it in our daily lives. But if you get 0.2% faster growth, this is for an example with the US economy where we are today, by the time you get 25 years out, there's nearly $4,500 of additional per capita output in your country. The cumulative increase in per capita GDP would be more than $53,000. Again, that's a tiny difference in the rate of economic growth. So if you have a policy reform that can generate 0.2% additional growth, I get very frustrated. I go in and I talk to politicians in Washington and I say, well, do X or do Y. Here are some good reforms. And I show them some economic data and some studies. And they sometimes sound very unimpressed. Well, I'm going to do that when it's going to make only this tiny difference. I try to underscore that over time, even tiny differences make a big, big difference for the livelihood, the prosperity, and the well-being of a people. Now, Frans already mentioned, if you look at economic freedom of the world, you have these 5 different categories. And of course, today, we're mostly focusing on rule of law. I actually call this category quality of governance. Legal system, property rights, they have all these different it's a hodgepodge of different things, but it basically measures how honest and competent the government operates. And I actually make the argument, and this is ironic because some of my left-wing friends make the same argument. They say, oh, no, if you look at the data, these other things don't really matter as much. It's rule of law that matters the most. And I say, well, I'm glad you're on our side because I view rule of law as the foundation. And then these other policies are like the house you build on a foundation. If you have a very bad foundation of sand or whatever, and you build the nicest house you could imagine on it, that nice house isn't going to last very long, probably. But if you build even a mediocre house on a very strong foundation, it can last for a long time. And I think this is one of the reasons. Why is it that some of the European welfare states, even though they have very expensive governments, why have they continued to be relatively rich by world standards? Well, first, they got rich before government became big. But then once government became big, they maintained rule of law. Those are still very honest places to do business, to invest money. You're going to get fair court rulings. The bureaucracy is very honest. So as much as I criticize European welfare states, most European nations still do a very, very good job on the quality of governance, rule of law, things like that. So we're talking about this in the context of how to get more economic growth. And of course, we want to focus on this last part. I acknowledge sometimes there's a little bit of luck. Sometimes you have the right geography, you have great ports and things like that. Sometimes you have a bunch of oil or something like that. Now, that's actually sometimes a mixed blessing. There's something in economics called the resource curse, where a government will be bad precisely because it has an easy source of wealth. But in an honest government, natural resources are a good thing. Let's talk about this in the context of South Africa. Ranked number 94 out of 162 countries. That's not a very good ranking. If you look at legal systems and property rights, what I call the quality of governance indicator, South Africa has declined. Of course, it made a giant jump when you got rid of apartheid and liberalized, in effect, that big chunk of your economy. That was great news for South Africa, but then you were as high as 6.44, and now you're down to 5.19. In other words, the trend line is wrong for the country. Now, why does this matter? Well, in the broad context, remember, South Africa ranked 94, not very high. If you're in the least free category, this is per capita income. If you're in the top category, this is per capita income. In other words, almost 8 times as much income if you're in the top category for economic freedom. Now, let's break it down, because that's looking at all economic freedom based on all public policies. Now let's look at the International Property Rights Index. The good news, South Africa is in the top 50% of countries. The bad news is that your score is falling. As a matter of fact, the most recent edition of the International Property Rights Index, South Africa had the single greatest fall of any country in the world. Not a very positive development for South Africa. Here's the measure of South Africa. You're at the bottom of the second quintile. That's if you don't include gender equity. If you include gender equity, you're at the top of the third quintile. Again, not a horrible score. By developing world or emerging economy standards, South Africa historically has gotten good scores. The problem is that the trend line is not going in the right direction. And why does this matter? Well, this is sort of equivalent to that chart I just showed you. Based on economic freedom of the world, what's your per capita GDP? Well, if you're in the bottom 20% of the property rights index, look how poor you are compared to if you're in the top of the International Property Rights Index. In other words, there's a lot of correlation between these different, I guess I better not drop the batteries out of this. There's a lot of correlation between these different measures. Countries that tend to have good rule of law usually tend to have good policies in other areas as well. Let's look at the World Bank's governance indicators. And I picked 4 of them: government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, control of corruption. And you see a not terribly good, well, first of all, the scores tend to be in the 60s, which is not great, not terrible. There are plenty of countries with far worse scores. Again, South Africa tends to be at the top end of emerging economies. Well, you want to be at least in the bottom end of the developed economies. You want to be climbing, not falling. But if you look from 2007 to 2017 on all these categories, for the most part, you see a trend line where South Africa's scores are slowly falling, not a positive development. Now let's put this in the context talking about cronyism. And I want to emphasize something very important about what Frans said. Etched above the Supreme Court in the United States is the phrase equal justice under law, equal treatment under the law, treat everyone the same, the sense of fair play. All those phrases mean a lot, because the opposite of fair play is cronyism. Because what is cronyism? It's all sorts of different policies where politicians and bureaucrats get to reward their friends, punish their enemies, in effect use the political system to accumulate political power and campaign contributions and things like that. And that, of course, is the opposite of what capitalism is. See, I was very good. I didn't say crony capitalism. I was able to make last-minute changes in my presentation and save myself from getting that accusation. And here's sort of a simple way of thinking about capitalism versus corporatism or statism or cronyism. They're different ways of saying the same thing. But here's what I think ultimately matters. Under cronyism, consumers no longer drive profitability. It's your connection your relationship with politicians. That's what drives profitability. Of course, I don't even like using the term profitability because to me, a profit is something that you earn honestly. If you get some sort of money simply because the government is somehow steering money your way, undermining your competitors or something like that, that's not what you want. And that's in effect the description of corporatism here. It just shows how a company uses its wealth to manipulate the government into giving it more power. And that, again, is the opposite of capitalism. Now, let's look at an example from The Economist. They tried to measure the dark section. This is, first of all, billionaire wealth as a percentage of GDP ranked by Crony sector wealth. So if you have a big dark bar as opposed to a lighter bar, that means more of your rich people are rich because of cronyism. And you see that Russia is one of the worst, Malaysia is really bad, Philippines, Singapore, which sort of surprises me. And I sort of wonder what their definitions are, so I don't even know what the methodology is here. But Ukraine is really bad. And then you got countries like Germany that are really good, South Korea, Japan, France, United States, we do a pretty good job. South Africa, okay. Not great, you're not down here, but you're definitely not way up here. Again, I don't know the methodology that The Economist used, and Singapore definitely stands out to me as a, since it's ranked so high for economic freedom, how can all the billionaires be getting money through cronyism? I don't know. But here's some research on the US economic system, and this is very depressing. It shows what is the estimated impact on operating margin in percentage terms. If you invest money as a business, that helps you generate income. That's good. We expect that. That's how the economy is supposed to work. You take a risk, you invest your money in response to what you hope to be consumer demand, and then you get some profits from it. And research and development, that's fine too. You want companies to be thinking long term and trying to come up with new technologies to make themselves, to make products that'll be valuable to consumers. This is terrible. Regulation and lobbying, that is not wealth creation. That is, well, it's two things, because I don't want to imply it's all bad. If you're lobbying to protect yourself from government, that's noble. If the government has some really bad policy where they're going to jack up taxes or impose massive new mandates and regulations, I want the business community in Washington knocking on doors saying, don't do this, it'll hurt our economy, don't make the United States more like Greece. Unfortunately, a lot of regulation and lobbying in Washington is from companies looking for favors from the government. In effect, they don't want that equal treatment under law. They don't want that equal justice under law. They want the government to tilt the playing field, sort of like that iceberg that we showed. This is what they're looking for when they're lobbying. Monopolies, non-competitive bidding, loan guarantees, protectionism, subsidy. These are bad things for an economy that undermine economic efficiency. Remember that slide I showed earlier about how if you have capital and labor getting misallocated, you wind up with less growth in your economy, less prosperity. And again, over the long run, that matters a whole lot. So this is very bad news for the U.S. to see that regulation and lobbying has such an important impact on the bottom line of companies. Even if it's all good lobbying, i.e. self-protection, you don't want companies having to focus on protecting themselves from Washington. You want them focusing on how can we generate more growth and more prosperity. And here's a World Bank study on Ukraine. And I show this because so many people leap to the wrong conclusion. This is showing two different measures of politically connected companies. In other words, cronyist companies. And what do you see? Well, you see that productivity is much lower in those companies. So everyone understands, yeah, that's bad. But then they see this thing, employment is higher. And they say, well, isn't that good? And it reminds me of the story about Milton Friedman. I don't even know if this is an urban legend or a real story, but supposedly he was in China back during the communist era. Of course, they're still nominally communist now, but this is back when they really were communists. And they were building a dam or something like that, and the workers were all going back and forth with shovels and wheelbarrows. And apparently somebody said to Milton Friedman, look how many more people we can give jobs to by building it this way instead of with bulldozers. And Friedman ostensibly said, well, why don't you give them teaspoons instead? Is that actually a true story?
Yeah, but it wasn't Friedman.
Is what?
It wasn't Friedman.
Oh, okay. Okay, well.
Attributed to him, it works.
Attributed to him, okay. Well, I'm from Washington, so that's as close as we ever get to being accurate. But the point is that it's not good to have, this is a measure of labor being misallocated. You're having workers produce less, measured by the productivity. In other words, the goal isn't to maximize employment, it's to maximize prosperity and productivity. In the long run, that's what maximizes income for everyone, because maybe some of those workers would be more productively allocated someplace else. So the average person in Washington, of course, politicians, jobs, 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 they look at this chart and they draw the wrong conclusion. This, of course, is an educated, intelligent, urbane, sophisticated audience, and you probably already understood this, but I still explained it anyhow. Well, I explained it because my friend Hartford's back there. He doesn't understand economics. Here's the moral of the story on all this. A lot of people think this is the debate, the rich versus the non-rich. No, this is really the debate, the people who earn money honestly versus the people who want money dishonestly. This is actually, I've written more than 5,000 columns on my blog. Far and away, this column where I simply presented this chart got the most views. Apparently, it really resonated with people. They understood. So whoever put this together, because it wasn't my creation, I simply shared it. Whoever put this together, I think, really touches on a very important observation about politics and public policy. Now I want to go ahead and spend some time looking at some slides of real-world evidence. Because if we understand that the rule of law is important, if we understand that property rights are important, if we understand that capitalism is better than cronyism, well, in some sense, even though I've shown some slides with some data, we're still talking about theory. And so what I want to do is give you a bunch of different examples where I take a free market-oriented economy compared to a state-driven economy. But I don't just look at 1 year of data, or even 5 years of data. Because every so often you get bizarre blips where maybe Greece grows faster than Hong Kong in any one given year. That might happen. Instead, I'm going to look at decades upon decades of data. And again, this ties back to earlier in my presentation when I said how important long-run growth is for higher living standards. I want to show you over multiple decades of data how free market economies perform compared to state-driven economies. And I'll start with this example because it totally shocked me. I got this example from a Greek economist, a good Greek economist. Don't blame him for what's happening in Greece. He said in a presentation we were both at in Europe, he said, well, do you know, back in the 1960s, Singapore and Jamaica had the same living standards. And I frankly didn't believe him. And so I went back and I looked at the Angus Madison data set used by the OECD and others, and sure enough, all through the early 1960s, Singapore and Jamaica had virtually the same levels of per capita GDP. What happened once Singapore went on their free market move, they in effect, they became independent in 1965 and went in the direction of free markets. Look at how much richer they've become than Jamaica, which is in blue, and of course the yellow here is simply the world average. Singapore, year after year, decade after decade, enjoyed very rapid growth, 5, 6, 7%, whereas Jamaica, with a more state-driven economy, all this you can see when you look at their ranking in the economic freedom of the world, Jamaica has lagged behind. Here's Hong Kong versus Cuba, another example that I actually looked up myself, because once I saw the Singapore-Jamaica thing, I said, I wonder what other examples we'll find like this. Well, all through the 1950s, Cuba and Hong Kong were the same. What happened at the end of the 1960s? At the end of the 1950s, Cuba went under communist rule, and Hong Kong, under some very good financial secretaries from the United Kingdom, went in the direction of free markets. And look now at the dramatic difference in prosperity between those different jurisdictions. Now, what I always say when I talk to my left-wing friends, I say, show me not a dozen different examples like I'm going to show you. I say, show me just one example. Show me one example with multiple decades of data of a state-driven economy outperforming a market-driven economy. And they've never been able to answer that question at all. Let's continue. Let's look at Africa. These are various sub-Saharan African countries. Botswana, is one of the highest ranked. It varies sometimes. I think Burundi or Rwanda beat them this year. But historically, Botswana has been the highest ranked sub-Saharan African country. Botswana, if you go back to 1965, was way down at the bottom of a relatively dismal, per capita GDP of less than $1,500, going all the way down to about $400. Well, Botswana, by having more economic freedom, it's not Hong Kong, it's not Singapore. I think they're ranked number 59 in the world, but by sub-Saharan African standards, that's a very high level of economic freedom. And look at what's happened to per capita living standards in Botswana compared to all these other countries. And again, Botswana started out at the bottom of all those countries, and yet it's outperformed them over time. Here's an example of the US, Hong Kong, and Singapore. You go back to 1950, the US was 4 times richer in terms of per capita GDP than Hong Kong and Singapore. What's happened over time? You can see, 1/4 the level. You can see that Singapore has now caught up and passed the United States, and Hong Kong is nipping at our heels. What's the difference? The U.S. generally gets good scores from economic freedom of the world. We're anywhere from, I think, as high as 6 to as low as number 18, but always, well in the top quartile of countries. But Hong Kong and Singapore are routinely, year in, year out, number 1 and number 2 for economic liberty, and that's enabled them to catch up to the United States. Here's a different way of looking at it. This is where you want to be. This is what's your ranking in world per capita GDP. So if you're here, you're number 1, you're 2, 3, all the way to 10, 20. All the way through the 1930s to the end of World War II, Argentina was one of the 10 richest countries in the world at points, but no lower than 15. And Hong Kong was way down here after World War II. They were a very poor place. And over time, look at what the difference in economic freedom and faster economic growth has meant. Hong Kong is now one of the richest places in the world, and Argentina is very poor. Now, I did this slide a number of years ago. If I updated it, you'd actually find that Argentina is now number 62. So they're continuing to go in the wrong direction. Hong Kong continues to be very wealthy. Here's Ukraine versus Poland. This is interesting because even though it's only about not even 30 years of data, they both started out about the same when the Soviet Empire collapsed. Poland did a lot of economic reform. Not Singapore, not Hong Kong. I think they were like number 33, if I remember correctly. But Ukraine is under 100. Ukraine has had no per capita GDP growth over all that time, whereas Poland is one of the fastest growing economies in Europe. Now, that's sort of like being the tallest midget in the circus, because Europe normally doesn't grow that fast. But nonetheless, you're talking about a doubling of per capita GDP in Poland. The people in Poland are certainly happy to get that doubling of per capita GDP compared to what you see in Ukraine. And oh, by the way, this data, the Russian invasion is here. So this data is not distorted by Putin messing around with the country. Here's Chile, Argentina, and Venezuela. You go back to 1980, Chile was very poor, Argentina was in the middle, and Venezuela was comparatively rich. Venezuela has had a whole series of statist dictators. Sometimes they're right-wing statist dictators, sometimes they're left-wing statist dictators, but in all cases, government controlling the economy and driving, or I wouldn't say driving, crashing the economy. Well, look what's happened over 30 years. Chile, with economic reform, they're now the highest ranked country in Latin America by far. They're now the richest country. In other words, they had a giant increase. Argentina is sort of a mixed economy. They've had a small increase, and Venezuela has had almost no economic growth. And as a matter of fact, if I updated this chart, it would be even more dramatic. I need to update it because I first started using this chart probably about 7 or 8 years ago. There's always like a couple of year lag in terms of the data you can get, so I could probably get data all the way up to at least 2015 now. Here's North Korea, South Korea. I mean, is there any more dramatic difference between two otherwise similar countries with similar people, similar endowments, and look at the dramatic difference in the economic performance. South Korea used to be very much of a cronyist, cartel-driven economy. They're sort of like the Philippines, but look what happened once they liberalized their economy. Here's Cuba versus Chile, both Latin American countries. Chile was always richer. but look at how Chile took off right at the time Jose Piñera. Have you ever had Jose come speak here? Oh, he's a great speaker. He's got that marvelous Chilean accent, the workers and stuff like that. It's very, very fun to hear him talk. But once Chile did free market reforms, their economy prospered immensely. Here's Estonia versus the world average. I mentioned Estonia because it's the most free market economy in the post-Soviet world. They had a bubble back in 2008, 2009, so you can see that their economy took a big hit, but nonetheless, the trend line is still very positive compared to the world average. Same thing with Ireland. Ireland used to be a very state-driven economy until starting in the mid-'80s, early '90s, they started cutting spending, lowering taxes, things like that. Again, they had a bubble, just like Estonia, when we had the great financial crisis, but the trend line is enormously positive. Ireland is in the top 10 for economic freedom of the world. Estonia, by the way, is usually between 10 and 15, just to give you an idea. Here's another example, all of Africa versus Botswana. Botswana started lower, is now much higher. Again, from this region, free markets, limited government. You don't have to be perfect. Because again, Botswana's not perfect, Poland's not perfect. These countries still have too much statism for my taste. They should all strive to be like Hong Kong and Singapore. But look at what more freedom and less statism will do for your economy over multiple decades. Here's Chile versus the rest of the world, just to give you another way of looking at that data. Here's Taiwan and South Korea versus the rest of the world. Now here's the one that every year I teach for a week in China. And I don't think the students like it when I give this example, because I start by showing, look at this tremendous growth that China got when Deng Xiaoping started liberalizing in the late 70s, early 1980s. And the Chinese students, they look at this and they're justifiably proud. Their country has gone from horrible, wrenching poverty to at least some degree of middle-class prosperity with some liberalization. But I tell them, well, this is a vertical axis from 0 to 14,000. What if we do this and make it from 0 to 45,000? Well, China's still going up, but it doesn't quite look as impressive. And so I asked them, why do you think I changed the vertical axis? Well, I changed it because I wanted to show them something. I wanted to show them Taiwan versus China. Which, of course, I'm surprised I don't get arrested sometimes when I give this comparison. But then I follow through by saying, why is there this difference? Here's the difference. The ranking in economic freedom of the world, 21 versus 112. Now, China used to be at the bottom. They used to have like a score of 4 on the 1 to 10 scale, and now they have a score of something like 6.3 on a 1 to 10 scale. So a dramatic increase in economic liberty, but still far, far from where they could be. And I make the point, obviously, to the people where I teach, well, if the Chinese in Taiwan can become rich, if the Chinese in Hong Kong can become rich, if the Chinese in Singapore can become rich, certainly the Chinese in China can become rich. It's simply a question of how much economic freedom you have. And then my last example, I go back to Botswana again, but this time I bring South Africa and Zimbabwe into the equation. Because what country stands out for actually having the most movement? Botswana. So yeah, South Africa is better off now than it used to be, and there's no question that ending apartheid and freeing up that amount of the economy was a very positive thing. But things have sort of leveled off. Now that's only looking at a relatively short period of data, so I don't want to make too much out of that, because again, sometimes you get temporary blips in data that don't mean much. But this trend line, I think, is pretty unmistakable over time, as is this trend line over time. Again, all I'm simply trying to do is put some flesh on the bones to this argument that if you have the right policies, if you have that good foundation of rule of law, property rights, quality governance, you're going to wind up having a chance, especially with the other right policies, to make either significant or dramatic moves in the right direction. And that's really what I'm saying. The world's a laboratory. We see natural experiments all over the world. Why don't we learn from them? And again, that challenge I give my left-wing friends, give me one example over multiple decades of a state-driven economy doing better than a free market economy. And by the way, I oftentimes will then augment this presentation by saying, where would you rather be a poor person? Do you want to be a poor person in let me find a good example. Well, the left is always saying, oh, you know, free markets are heartless. Well, Chile probably doesn't have much of a welfare state, but would you rather be a poor person in Chile or Venezuela? I mean, actually, Venezuela is probably now down to here because their economy's really collapsed over the last several years. Where do you want to be a poor person, in Ukraine or Poland? Where will you have more opportunity? Where do you want to be a poor person, Argentina or Hong Kong? In Hong Kong, the government literally brags about how little welfare spending there is. I've been in conferences where Hong Kong government officials brag that total redistribution spending is less than 2 to 3% of GDP. Most governments brag about, oh, we care so much about our people, we care so much, and we show this by how much we spend redistributing. But if all you're doing is, in effect, trapping people in dependency, you're not doing them any favors. In Hong Kong, if you're born rich, you have a much better chance if you're born poor, you have a much better chance of winding up becoming rich because of the economic opportunity and the fact that the government isn't smothering you with kindness. So, as I said, the world's a laboratory. Let's learn the right lessons from that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to, for questions and discussion, suggest you each bring a chair up and sit up here. I'm not sure how we capture that that's Stuart's problem, but I think you've got both. Are you both still mic'd up?
Yes,
Good.
at least I am.
And I'm going to suggest that you take the questions. You don't have me to moderate. So why don't you, being the visitor, you choose who's going to be next, and then see who it's directed.
Can I auction off the questions?
If you don't like them, you can offer them. Sorry?
Oh, are we going to have a microphone for people asking questions? Okay.
I've got a question for each of you. My name is Mark Altman from Johannesburg Bar. Dan, my question is a very technical one. On the axis you have dollar GDPs. Does that take into account the changing value in those countries' currencies? And does it take into account, is that absolute value or a kind of adjusted value? Because obviously it would make a big difference. Those graphs would look very different. In other words, in South Africa, for example, we've had enormous rand-dollar volatility. My guess is that our GDP might actually be going down because our rand is so worthless.
I think virtually every, if not all, virtually every one of those examples was based on the Angus-Madison data set. And you can go online. He uses something called, it's an international dollar based on purchasing power parity. Now, I've never actually tried to reverse engineer the methodology, so I don't know if I would totally agree that they're doing it exactly the right way. But one of the advantages of looking at multiple decades of data is I assume that even if in any one period of time some exchange rate volatility isn't captured perfectly, when you're looking at 4 or 5 decades of data, I assume it washes out. And so we're getting a good, accurate look. But if that's your area of expertise, just Google Angus-Madison database. And it's a great source of long-run data. He's now passed away, but he has a team of I think it's the University of Groningen in Netherlands. There's a team that are continuing the project, and it's really, really a helpful data source.
Excellent, thanks. Frans, thank you for your talk. I agree with almost everything you said. I just have a couple of comments. The one is when you were defining rule of law, I mean, I think you largely talked about it as a kind of content structure. You know, I think about Lon Fuller's famous essay about King Rex, you know, produces all these different laws, none of which are really laws because they're contradictory or they're not published. But you added this extra notion at one point, which is the idea that legislature must legislate in the interests of the people. That seems to imply a kind of content, because later on you talk about the arbitrariness of determining price by reference to subjective preference. In other words, it is always a matter of subjective preference, not an objective question. And so I wonder if you run into that problem where the state says, well, we are doing this in the interest of the people, and we know what the interests of the people are. So as soon as you add that in, you run into all the dangers. The second thing is that there's this Constitutional Review Committee is about to give their recommendation as to whether the Constitution ought to be changed. The question is whether there can be a rule of law challenge. So if expropriation without compensation with regards to land is put into our Constitution, can it be argued that because rule of law is in section 1 of our Constitution, and that the rule of law has some sort of substantive content, like a protection of property rights, could that be used as a challenge or not?
Yes. Both very good questions. I link the public interest requirement to rationality. A law must be enacted for a purpose, and any act must withstand the test of rationality. Now that rationality must be traced back to the purpose of the law, and the purpose of the law is the public interest. So I see it more as a rationality test than a policy test. In other words, the legislature or the administrative official is not required to decide what is in the best interest of the people, and that being the test, but it must be rational. So that's as far as I take it. I don't think a government should ever, just as a government shouldn't set the value of a property or the price of a property, just so it should not attempt to second guess the substantive content. So that's the reason why I traced it back. It's a rationality test. Whereas the alternative is to say that something else, something other than the public interest, or the interest which is the ostensible purpose of the law, drives the decision. And then it becomes arbitrary and we lose compass completely. So that's the first point. And then to link that back to the reference to everybody knows what is good for them, I think that is a rational decision. I was to say that people act in their own best interests. That is a perfectly rational approach. What the outcome will be, we don't have to second guess. The rational approach is to say, as far as possible, the law should not interfere. It's almost like the medical conundrum of first do no harm. So that's that is that question, and the other one is about the rule of law challenge, whether there is a basis for a rule of law challenge. Martin van Staden has more of a view on that, but I personally think that the rule of law is a substantive requirement of our Constitution, and I'm really hoping, and it's still being developed, but I'm really hoping that it will develop into a substantive challenge of the property clause, but it depends. We don't know what it's going to say. That's the first difficulty. But I like to see, and Leon, we can revisit the point, but there is a question about whether it's part of the rule of law.
Here and then there.
Thanks, Dan. My question's for you. So you highlighted the example of China, and that seems to be something of an outlier in terms of their rule of law and adherence to property rights. I mean, it certainly seems the case that China's phenomenal growth in the last 30 years has been attributed to more liberalization, unlocking that latent potential that existed there before. But how do you account for their weak adherence to property rights and the rule of law? What's going on there, and doesn't that distort the correlation argument that you suggest?
Well, I think that's an explanation for why China is so far behind Taiwan and even farther behind Hong Kong and Singapore. Going from 4 to 6.3 or whatever their score is now was a big improvement, but 6.3 in relative terms to other countries is still a bad score. And I personally think China's financial system is very fragile because they have far too much cronyism. You basically have resources being allocated through a state-controlled, maybe not technically state-owned, but a state-controlled financial system where credit allocation is totally politicized. So I think China has a lot of problems. I'm happy that they've gone from sort of wrenching Mao-style material deprivation to now per capita GDP of, what was it, $7,000 or $8,000. That's a nice improvement, but it's you know, to me, there's no contradiction between saying they've had some improvement and they still have a long, long way to go. By the way, let me say one thing about rule of law, then we'll get to your question. The one thing I would have liked to include in my presentation, but I don't have the technical capacity to do it, if you go to YouTube and type in A Man for All Seasons, Rule of Law. There's a great scene from that movie. I don't know, have you seen it? Everyone do that when you get home. Don't do it on your phones right here. When you get home, Google in YouTube or type in YouTube, Man for All Seasons, Rule of Law. It's a great scene where one of the actors in the movie is explaining why everyone deserves the rule of law, even people. He basically argues, I would give the devil the rule of law, because if you in effect chop down the trees that are the law, then there's nothing to stop other people from then being abused by the lack of rule of law. So it's really either one of us should have been smart enough to figure out.
Thomas More. It's a play about Thomas More.
Yes. Yeah. So, but your question.
Yeah. My question is actually to Frans. It's a comment. You spoke about the issue of compensation to give redress to past wrongs. And you made something which to me came as almost as a surprise, is that you said that the people who experienced wrongs were not just those who were discriminated against, but also the people who were doing the discrimination. In other words, the white population suffered. And I thought that was kind of strange and contrary, but I was reminded of a comment which the late Zach de Beer and Colin Eglin used to make, quoting Hendrik Verwoerd, who apparently once said he would rather be poor and white than rich and integrated. And that suggests that the people who suffered a wrong as a result of apartheid were not just the people who are traditionally regarded as being discriminated against. Your comments?
Yes, no, I agree. I think he implicitly recognized the point that I made, that perhaps there was such a devotion to the ideology that it was seen as value. It was seen as life quality value to be, even if the cost of it is being poor. Because if you look at the economics of it, that is exactly what we did. We actually made ourselves poorer. It's a terrible realization, which is why I think it's impossible to unscramble the egg. There's no way we can go back and figure out who would have had what, and somehow try and recreate that fair utopia that would have existed.
Okay, there, and then Leon.
Hi. First question to you then. Your comparison, for example, to Botswana and the rest of Africa, I think is a bit distorted, because Botswana has a population of 2 million with the same land base as South Africa, has 64 million people. And color is not a base of who owns the land and how everything operates over there, which also leads me to you, Frans, where you say, color should not be a reason for, what do you say, for example, this, disentitlement, for example. But isn't that a reason why there is disentitlement in South Africa at the moment, because of color? And more importantly, like a theoretical, hypothetical question, if I was to be a Bonsmara farmer and you were to be a Bonsmara farmer, but because your grandfather has a farm and there's 100 or 80 years of experience behind that, wouldn't you have a bit of an advantage to distribute your cows as opposed to myself? Who started off now?
Well, on your first question, there is some economic research suggesting that small states, as defined by small populations, can do better. So should the data be adjusted somewhat? There are plenty of small states out there that do a terrible job. So maybe there is some advantage, and maybe when you're looking at small states that do very well, I mean, Singapore and Hong Kong, you're talking about 8 million people, and I think in those jurisdictions, so they're not terribly small by world standards. You have some very big countries like the U.S. that historically have done reasonably well, averaging about number 10 in economic freedom. So I'm a little skeptical about automatically adjusting the data based on small or big populations, because again, when you're looking at 50, 60 years of data, I think that probably does wash out. And again, I mentioned in one of my earlier slides, sometimes there's luck, natural resources, geography. But again, sometimes natural resources are a curse, not a blessing, depending on whether the government uses them as a way of just getting wealth without having to try, without having good economic policy. So I'm given all the obvious imperfections of trying to draw conclusions about simply one piece of data, per capita GDP, I nonetheless think that looking at those long periods of time and looking at the economic freedom in one country versus another, I think that does at least tell us some lesson that's worth listening to.
Maybe just to respond to the question about the suggestion that being that there is such a thing as white privilege, I'm on record as saying that is so. As a result of discrimination of the past, white people are better off than black people because they've deprived black people of opportunities. But the second point that I then make is that if we had had a fair dispensation from the start, that doesn't mean that everybody would have been on the same level of income. We don't know what the outcome would have been. It's impossible to tell. And the second point is so that's a moral point, of a policy point, if you like. And the second point is that as the result of that, what happens is you eventually undermine the very object that you're trying to achieve, which is ultimately to improve the lives of black poor people. That's the aim. It's better to be richer as a result of growth than equal as a result of shared poverty. And that is the point that I think we're making.
If I was to study, for example, in agriculture, and I was to excel in agriculture, say if I was to study agriculture and I was to excel in agriculture but did not have land, and you have land and you do not excel in agriculture, it was something that was brought upon through the years, would I not be allowed to at least acquire a bit of land so that I can improve what I've learned?
You are. You are entitled.
I'm not necessarily entitled, but do you think there should be some sort of provision whereby I know how to farm? Can I have some land?
Yeah. The point I'm simply making is that there are two consequences of that. The first is you cannot unscramble the egg. You can't say who would have had what. And the second point is it has consequences. If you start fiddling with the fundamental rule of law structure, what you do is you undermine trust, and the people who are in a position to develop the country will start saying, is this a place where we want to invest our money? So that has a practical consequence. And that is where poor people suffer the most.
Okay. Leon?
Yes, firstly, a comment, Dan, about China is I get very personally frustrated when everyone, all of us, Economic Freedom for the World, we're a partner, talk about China as one thing, one place, the Chinese economy of China. It has these 6 or 7 special economic zones where 80% of the capital formation occurs, and those are the freest economies on earth at the moment, and any generalized statement about China has to, by virtue of its immense difference between China as a whole and these very, very large special economic zones, massive cities, just are not made. And the question is, the special zones are the freest economies on earth, and they are the ones where the Chinese growth occurs. That's where it comes from. It doesn't actually, the rest of the country is pretty stagnant. And I'm happy to share data with you on that. I have a question to Frans about the removal of Section 25 of the Property Rights Clause. And in this room are some formidable lawyers. And let's say I'm on the other side and I'm saying we should remove it, and it has no rule of law implication. We could have had a constitution without it there in the first place. In fact, that's how the constitution was finally agreed. There wasn't a Section 25 at all. So why not just not have it? If it weren't there, would there be a rule of law argument to put it in? And I think the answer is no, because very few constitutions in the world have such a clause. So isn't the argument for removing it simply quite simple? What's the difference, whether it's there or not? And bearing in mind, as I say, that the final constitution agreed at Arniston never had one. The reason it's there is because we, the Free Market Foundation, lobbied for it. So we, if anyone, should want it to stay there. But I'm just worried about saying there's a rule of law argument for keeping it. There's a rule of law argument as to how you amend the Constitution, but I don't see a rule of law argument saying there must be a property clause.
That is a difficult question. I don't know that it is in fact so, and I've looked at a few, that most constitutions don't have a property protection clause. But it seems to me that if you analyze what you do if you don't have protection of property is extremely fundamental in terms of how people determine the outcomes of their lives. Short of actually saying you can take people's lives away, which is the most fundamental one, there's probably very little more serious than taking people's property away. And the reason why that is so is that is the means by which we determine the outcome of our lives. That's how we determine what happens to us, whether our lives improve or not.
But is that a policy statement or a constitutional statement?
I think it ends up being a constitutional statement, because if you take that away, you end up with a situation where the state has arbitrary power over people's lives. And that can't be not a breach of the rule of law. Because this is how I self-actualize, if you like. This is what I do with my life.
The rule of law provision stays there, section 1. But you just remove section 25. Why does the Constitution have to have a section 25? According to what principle of constitutional law?
Well, it doesn't have to have any of the clauses.
To win this argument, note.
Yeah, it doesn't have to have any of the clauses.
It doesn't have to have a Bill of Rights at all, as the original US Constitution never had.
Yes.
So if you take away any section in the Bill of Rights, so what?
Then you may not have that right. But the question is whether that makes it not a rule of law constitution. I think that's the point you're driving. And I think there's an argument to be made that property, the right to property, respect of property, for the reason which I've stated, is that the alternative is a fundamental and arbitrary interference in the way people improve their lives. You can't not have that effect, because the moment you don't have the protection.
All land belongs to the state. What's arbitrary about that?
All right, well, let's try.
It doesn't.
We're past 8 o'clock, so I see 3 hands up. Let's actually take the questions all at one time and then answer them all at one time.
Although a lawyer, a bit of thin ice here, but if all the property belonged to the state, then the people of the country would not really be able to stand up to the tyranny of the state, which would eventually eventuate. That's my understanding of one of the important philosophical reasons why the state should not own and be able to control and do what they want to with land. People must own their land and control it, and in that way they can resist what would become the tyranny of the state. And the rule of law, as I've understood it in this and in other presentations we've had here, is fundamentally to counter tyranny and what have you, if that helps a little bit.
All right, back there.
My question is, isn't the whole concept of the rule of law an attempt to sort of regulate the use of force rather than, wouldn't it be better just to say, okay, let's have a society governed only by contract, and then let's say more, you wouldn't need to have a principle of the rule of law. You would just say, okay, everyone decides what they do with their property, and since our rights are natural anyway, everyone knows exactly what is due to them, and then they can decide what to do with what they have and what belongs to them.
And last question, we're going to take all three and then wrap up.
So I just wanted to clarify a point that was being made. I think the question is, should our constitution have a requirement, which is section 1, to have the rule of law? Because it's the only constitution in the world that has the requirement of rule of law into the constitution. Other constitutions is presumed to be there. So the question isn't whether the property clause, section 25, should be there, but whether the rule of law should be in providing the fundamental constitution. As far as the property rights, the United States Constitution gets it right. It's not in the United States Constitution because the Declaration of Independence correctly states it. We the people have the right to life, liberty and property. So these fundamental rights are not given to us by our Constitution. We have it, and we can protect those rights. Then the amendment to the Constitution was, no one shall deprive you of your right, liberty and property without the due process of law. So we don't need a requirement of section 25 in the Constitution because all of those rights we do have. If you wish to take those rights, then as in the case of the United States Constitution, we would have to articulate how it can be done. And the United States Constitution says you can take the rights with compensation. So you can't take it without compensation. So I think the United States Constitution is actually an excellent constitution, which outlines the way the fundamental principles work. But the real question is, in our section 1, we say the fundamental requirement of the Constitution is the rule of law. Now that's not in any other constitution. And the problem which I've argued before, if you want to now take property rights, you're going to have to amend section 1. Otherwise you're going to violate the Constitution. Sorry. Thanks.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the rule of law is part of our Constitution.
It is. Section 1.
Yes.
It's actually written into the Constitution, which is not in other constitutions.
Yes. I'm not convinced that that there's an inalienable right that everybody has. It has to have a source. So you either have a constitutional right or you have some other source of the right, which can be through your common law operation, that you simply have pronouncements which are then accepted and attain legitimacy. That's another way that you can do it. But we happen to have a rule of law provision in our Constitution. So I think that means that that is the source from which we derive it. We may have had it, in the absence of that we could have had the debate, but we happen to have it, so we can use it.
All right, a couple of observations on the questions. Hong Kong government owns every plot of land except for the original Anglican church, and property is leased to people. So it's a very galling thing to me, because I agree with you instinctively that private property and private ownership is key, yet Hong Kong happens to very successfully operate a system where they lease out the land and they retain the ownership of it. On the U.S. system, one interesting little quirk of this is, yes, you can't take, well, first of all, you can't take life, liberty, or property without due process of law, but you can't take property without just compensation, historically, only for public use. But we had a very disturbing Supreme Court decision, the Kelo decision, where the government was allowed to take private property for private use, simply because they thought the new owner would generate more tax revenue. Hopefully, with the Supreme Court changes we've had, we can overturn that decision. And then I guess let me make one final, I don't know whether this is throwing a grenade in the room, but years ago, 30 years ago, I worked for Senator Bob Packwood of Oregon. He was very interested in land reform in Central America, where you didn't have the same history of apartheid, but you definitely had a system of oligarchy, where the land was almost all owned by the old families and things like that, and you had a mass of poor peasantry. And Packwood had this idea. We never were able to get it into law, but either through the U.S. aid dollars or through the U.S. influence on the dispensation of World Bank and IMF dollars and things like that, Packwood wanted to use that money, instead of just giving grants to politicians where it just winds up in their pockets, why not just use that money to, in effect, buy land on the open market from the oligarchs and then give it to the peasantry? So, you're actually redressing past wrongs. You're not stealing the land from the existing landowners, because maybe their ancestors did something bad, but their descendants probably aren't necessarily bad people, and would use the aid for something that was actually good, instead of for lining the pockets of the governing elite. So I don't know whether something like that would ever be an idea for South Africa, but it strikes me as perhaps one small way of maybe unscrambling the egg. And how do we have other hands coming up? Do we have rule of law on this, or do we just do? Is it the arbitrary whim of the moderator here?
We have the rule of clock. But I don't know. You can go on. Are you happy to take another one or two?
There were a couple of hands that are very anxious here.
If you're so excited,
no, I've got to. You shook me there with your information about Hong Kong. Then I've just been thinking. I think constitutions are there not to keep a check on benevolent dictators. Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew. I mean, gee, what did he achieve? But he was a benevolent dictator. He just happened to be a good dictator. And I think constitutions are there, perhaps Mandela, not so much to deal with the likes of Mandela, but for successive, lesser leaders, and no need to get into names. My question is, at this point in time, mainland China ruling Hong Kong, okay, but let's see down the track. At present, it looks as if they're becoming more liberal and what have you. If they go less liberal, then that very position may make Hong Kong very vulnerable. So I think constitutions are really there to deal with the bad guys over a long period of time, if I can put it simply.
Here's an observation on Hong Kong. The business community, which is ultra-free market, is actually allied with the communist leadership in Beijing. Why? Because neither one of them want direct democracy. The business community worries that the masses will vote for a welfare state, and Beijing is worried that they'll just vote for, self-determination or something like that. So it's a very strange situation where you have these two groups who you would think would be mortal enemies, but they have a common desire to just leave the status quo alone, which by and large I think is very good for the people of Hong Kong. Yes, sir.
So I've just listened to this rationale that things has to be judged by, but I think the perspective of people at different ends of the population have got total different ideas of the rationale. We might perceive the rationale in a certain way, and if you go to somebody that's disenfranchised, that doesn't have any property, that's got nothing to lose, you will have a totally different perspective. And I believe that a redistribution of land, if it is done in a sensible way, that people start having things that they can lose. If he's got a title deed, and if it's worth 5,000 rand, it's 5,000 rand that he can lose. He will start behaving a bit more responsible. Also, you don't develop on land that you don't own. You don't put your money in there if you don't own the land. And I think that the sooner we can get title deeds out to the vast amount of the population, on whichever basis, I've got other ideas for later time there, but I think that is very important, that that process should happen.
No, private ownership is great. It helps turn people into capitalists.
We have two passionate hands, and I have to say they are going to be last. One there and one here.
Okay. So
I'm taking over at this stage.
This
is the rule of Leon.
I'm just going to repeat the question I asked before since it wasn't addressed. My question basically was, isn't rule of contract superior to rule of law, basically?
Isn't that the same thing? Or maybe that's a lawyer question.
No, I don't think the rule of law and the rule of contract is the same thing. The question that you asked is whether the one is superior to the other. I've always, and we have debated this before, is just that ultimately you need a mechanism to enforce the rule of contract. And that's where your rule of law becomes important, because the court must have oversight. So I don't see how else you break that conundrum.
Okay, but you have in the world today many countries which are sovereign. Like you can project that to individuals in the same way that individuals can be seen as being sovereign. So how do countries enforce treaties among themselves? Because you have different countries which have different laws within the countries.
How do countries
enforce treaties?
Oh, treaties, yes. They agree. I think that's the answer to that one. They agree. So you would notionally have to have a scenario where everybody agrees to be bound. And ultimately what that boils down to is a type of social contract. So
and sometimes they abrogate treaties, and sometimes they cheat on treaties.
You go back to some form of authority, I think. But maybe I'm wrong.
I relate to that question because I think it is important. International law, so-called, relies on an assumption that treaties will be honoured. Not just government to government, but private to private. And you know, I think that's a big discussion, which I relate to it, and I think there's a lot of merit in it. The last one?
Last one also the same. I was not very much satisfied with your answer, and I'll try to simplify it. So if I could use your land for better of myself and the country, but because it's your Opa's land, you gave that land to you, would I be wrong to ask for it?
Yeah.
But who decides? Who decides that?
Will you pay for it? Pay for it.
Who decides that you will be better?
How did your Opa get it?
My question
because he knew how to farm the land, correct? And if I know how to farm the land, why can't I get it?
I think that's where you enter the realm of arbitrary.
But what about to Opa? Opa got the land because you could farm the land, correct? No, he didn't buy it. Okay, anyway, thanks.
Rule of law, rule of law. That's it. So let me just say thank you for coming across the oceans to come and share your wisdom with us and your information. Are we going to be able to put your presentation on our website so that people can access that data? Or is it
Sure.
Yeah, oh, that's great. So we'll do that, and then, because there was lots of data and information there of great value, and also the law. I personally would like the lawyers in this room, and there are, let me say, some formidable ones, to sit around and debate the issue, because I feel that there's really, this is not satisfactorily addressed as a jurisprudential question yet, and I would like to see that happen. So, thank you very much, and thank them in the usual way.